Sarah Martinez had always been different from other kids in her neighborhood. While other children played with dolls or video games, she spent hours studying maps and reading military strategy books her grandfather left behind. Her grandfather, Colonel James Martinez, had served 3 tours in Vietnam and always told her that the mind was the most powerful weapon anyone could possess. Growing up in East Los Angeles wasn't easy for a young Hispanic girl who dreamed of something bigger than the gang-controlled streets around her. Sarah's mother, Rosa, worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table after her father disappeared when she was 7. The neighborhood was ruled by the Diablos gang, and their leader, Miguel El Jeef Ramirez, had been watching Sarah grow up with increasing interest. By the time Sarah turned 18, she had developed an unusual reputation. Unlike most teenagers who either joined gangs for protection or lived in constant fear, Sarah had found a third way. She had studied every gang member's routine, mapped their territories, and understood their weaknesses better than they understood themselves. Her friends called her crazy, but Sarah called it survival. The trouble started on a hot Tuesday morning in July when Sarah witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. While walking to her job at the local grocery store, she accidentally saw El Jeef and his lieutenants meeting with a corrupt police detective named Frank Morrison. Money changed hands, and Sarah heard them discussing plans to frame an innocent family for drug dealing so they could take over their small business. Sarah knew she was in danger the moment she locked eyes with Morrison across the parking lot. The detective had a reputation for making problems disappear, and El Jeef never left witnesses alive. She quickly looked away and continued walking, but she could feel their eyes following her every step. That evening, Sarah's mother noticed her daughter's unusual behavior. Rosa had raised Sarah alone and knew every one of her daughter's moods and expressions. Sarah was normally confident and talkative, but tonight she seemed distant and worried. "Mija, what's wrong?" Rosa asked while preparing dinner in their small kitchen. Sarah wanted to tell her mother everything, but she knew it would only put Rosa in danger too. Instead, she forced a smile and said, "Just tired from work, Mama. Nothing important." But Rosa wasn't convinced. She had survived in this neighborhood for 20 years by reading people and situations carefully. She could see the fear hiding behind her daughter's forced smile, and it scared her more than any gang threat ever had. The next morning, Sarah's worst fears were confirmed. As she walked to work, she noticed the same black Escalade following her at a distance. When she stopped to buy a newspaper, the car stopped too. When she crossed the street, it made a U-turn and continued following her from the opposite direction. Sarah's grandfather had taught her that panic was the enemy of clear thinking. She forced herself to breathe slowly and began implementing the lessons she had learned from years of studying military tactics. First rule, never let the enemy know you're aware of their presence. Second rule, always have multiple escape routes planned. Third rule, gather intelligence before taking action. Instead of going directly to work, Sarah took a longer route through the neighborhood. She used reflective windows and mirrors to observe her followers without looking directly at them. There were 3 men in the Escalade, and she recognized 2 of them as El Jeef's most trusted enforcers, Carlos Razor Gutierrez and Antonio Tank Valdez. Sarah knew both men by reputation. Razor was quick and violent, known for settling disputes with a switchblade. Tank was slower but incredibly strong, capable of breaking bones with his bare hands. The third man she didn't recognize, but his expensive suit and careful posture suggested he wasn't a typical gang member. As Sarah continued her surveillance, she began to understand the scope of the problem. This wasn't just about what she had witnessed. El Jeef was planning something much bigger, and her accidental discovery had threatened a carefully planned operation involving corrupt police officers and possibly other officials. By the time Sarah reached the grocery store, she had counted at least 6 different people watching her throughout her journey. They were being careful to rotate positions and maintain distance, but Sarah's trained eye caught the patterns. El Jeef was treating her like a serious threat, which meant they planned to eliminate her permanently. Sarah's boss, Mr. Kim, immediately noticed her distracted behavior. She had been working at his store for 2 years and was normally his most reliable employee. Today, she kept looking out the windows and jumping at every sound. "Sarah, you okay?" Mr. Kim asked during her lunch break. You seem very nervous today. Sarah realized she needed allies, but she had to be careful about who she trusted. Mr. Kim was a good man, but he had his own family to protect. Getting him involved could make things worse for everyone. I'm fine, Mr. Kim. Just didn't sleep well last night, she replied. But her eyes never stopped scanning the street outside. That afternoon, Sarah's situation became even more dangerous. Detective Morrison entered the store, supposedly to buy cigarettes, but Sarah saw him studying her carefully. He made a point of asking Mr. Kim about his employees, particularly the young Hispanic girl who works mornings. Morrison's presence confirmed Sarah's worst fears. The corruption went higher than just one detective, and they were gathering information about her daily routine, her family, and her friends. They were preparing to make their move, and Sarah knew she had very little time to act. After Morrison left, Sarah excused herself to use the restroom. Inside, she pulled out her phone and began documenting everything she remembered from the meeting she had witnessed. She wrote down every detail, the time, the location, the people involved, and the conversation she had overheard. Then, she uploaded the information to a secure cloud storage account she had created years earlier as part of her emergency preparedness plans. Sarah's grandfather had always told her that information was power, but only if it could be preserved and used effectively. She knew that having evidence wasn't enough. She needed a way to make that evidence matter, even if something happened to her. When Sarah returned to work, she noticed that the watchers had changed positions again. They were getting bolder, positioning themselves where she could see them more easily. This was psychological warfare, designed to make her panic and do something stupid. But Sarah's military education had taught her to recognize intimidation tactics and respond with calculated patience. As her shift ended, Sarah realized she faced a crucial decision. She could go home and pretend nothing had happened, hoping that El Jeef would decide she wasn't a threat. But Sarah knew enough about gang psychology to understand that showing weakness would only confirm their suspicions and make elimination more likely. Alternatively, she could run, pack her things, take her mother, and disappear to another city. But running would mean abandoning everything they had worked for, and there was no guarantee that El Jeef's reach wouldn't follow them wherever they went. The third option was the most dangerous, but potentially the most effective. Sarah could go on the offensive, using her knowledge of military tactics to turn the situation to her advantage. It would require careful planning, perfect timing, and the kind of strategic thinking that her grandfather had spent years teaching her. As Sarah walked home, carefully noting the position of every watcher, she began formulating a plan. She would use their own surveillance network against them, turning their strength into a weakness. But first, she needed to gather more intelligence and prepare her battlefield. That evening, Sarah sat at her small desk and began drawing detailed maps of the neighborhood. She marked every gang member's known residence, every escape route, every potential safe house, and every location where she might gain a tactical advantage. Her grandfather had always said that battles were won in the planning stage, long before the first shot was fired. Sarah's mother watched her daughter work with growing concern. The maps and tactical planning reminded Rosa of her late father-in-law's military days, and she began to understand that whatever Sarah was planning went far beyond typical teenage problems. "Sarah, talk to me," Rosa said, sitting down beside her daughter. "What kind of trouble are we in?" Sarah looked at her mother's worried face and realized she couldn't protect Rosa by keeping her in the dark. If El Jeef decided to target their family, Rosa would be safer knowing what they were facing. "Mama, I saw something I shouldn't have seen," Sarah began, and slowly explained everything that had happened over the past 2 days. Rosa listened in silence, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When Sarah finished, Rosa was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Your grandfather always said you had the mind of a soldier," Rosa said finally. "But soldiers don't fight alone, Mija. Who are our allies?" Sarah realized that her mother was right. Even the best military strategists relied on intelligence networks, supply lines, and trusted allies. If she was going to outsmart El Jeef and his corrupt police contacts, she would need help from people she could trust completely. "I've been thinking about that," Sarah replied. "There's Mrs. Chun F. The next morning, Sarah implemented the first phase of her plan with the precision of a trained operative. She knew that El Jeef's men would be expecting her to follow her usual routine, so she decided to use their expectations against them. Instead of taking her normal route to work, Sarah left her apartment 30 minutes early and took a completely different path through the neighborhood. Sarah's knowledge of the local geography became her first tactical advantage. She had spent years exploring every alley, shortcut, and hidden passage in the area. While El Jeef's men positioned themselves along her usual route, Sarah was already 3 blocks away, moving through a series of connected backyards and maintenance alleys that most people didn't even know existed. Her destination wasn't the grocery store where she worked, but rather the community center where Mrs. Chun ran literacy programs for immigrant families. Sarah had calculated that Mrs. Chun would arrive early to prepare for her morning classes, giving them privacy to discuss the situation without attracting attention. Mrs. Chun was indeed already at the center when Sarah arrived through the back entrance. The elderly woman looked surprised to see Sarah so early, but her expression quickly changed to concern when she noticed the young woman's serious demeanor. "Mrs. Chun, I need your help with something very important," Sarah said, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "I have information about police corruption, but I don't know who to trust in law enforcement." Mrs. Chun had been an investigative journalist in Taiwan before immigrating to the United States, and she still maintained many of the instincts that had made her successful in that dangerous profession. She studied Sarah's face carefully before responding. "Tell me everything," Mrs. Chun said, locking the front door and leading Sarah to her office. "And don't leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem." Sarah spent the next 20 minutes explaining everything she had witnessed, showing Mrs. Chun the detailed notes she had made about the meeting between El Jeef and Detective Morrison. Mrs. Chun listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. When Sarah finished her story, Mrs. Chun was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the information and considering the implications. Finally, she looked up with a grim expression. "This is bigger than just gang activity," Mrs. Chun said. "If Morrison is involved, there are probably other corrupt officials. We need to be very careful about who we approach with this information." Mrs. Chun explained that her years as a journalist had taught her to verify information through multiple independent sources before taking action. She suggested that Sarah continue her normal routine, while Mrs. Chun used her contacts to identify trustworthy people in law enforcement and local government. "The most important thing right now is that you stay safe while we develop this story," Mrs. Chun said. "Don't do anything that might make them suspicious of your activities." Sarah agreed, but she knew that simply maintaining her routine wouldn't be enough to ensure her safety. El Jeef's men were already watching her closely, and sooner or later they would make their move. She needed to accelerate her timeline while appearing to remain passive. After leaving the community center through the same back entrance, Sarah made her way to work using another indirect route. This time, she deliberately allowed herself to be seen by one of El Jeef's watchers, reinforcing the impression that she was following predictable patterns while actually gathering intelligence about their surveillance methods. At the grocery store, Sarah's behavior appeared normal to casual observation, but she was actually conducting a careful reconnaissance of her work environment. She identified every entrance and exit, every potential hiding place, and every item that could be used as an improvised weapon if necessary. Her grandfather had taught her that preparation was the foundation of survival. During her lunch break, Sarah made her way to St. Mary's Catholic Church, where Father Rodriguez was preparing for afternoon confessions. The priest had known Sarah since she was a child and had always been a source of guidance and support for her family. Father Rodriguez immediately noticed the tension in Sarah's posture and the worried expression she was trying to hide. He invited her into his office, where they could speak privately without being overheard by parishioners or potential eavesdroppers. "Father, I need advice about a moral dilemma," Sarah began, using language that would sound innocent to anyone who might be listening. "I know something about wrongdoing, but speaking up might put innocent people in danger." Father Rodriguez understood immediately that Sarah was dealing with something serious. In his 15 years serving this community, he had helped many young people navigate complex situations involving gangs, corruption, and violence. He had developed his own methods for communicating about sensitive topics without attracting unwanted attention. Sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when to seek help rather than trying to handle everything alone, Father Rodriguez said carefully. There are people in our community who specialize in helping with these kinds of problems. The priest explained that he had contacts in federal law enforcement who specialized in investigating corruption cases. He suggested that Sarah document everything she knew and prepare to present her information to people who had the authority and resources to act on it effectively. But, Father, what if they don't believe me? Sarah asked. I'm just a teenager from the barrio. Why would anyone take my words seriously? Because truth has its own power, Father Rodriguez replied. And because there are good people in positions of authority who are specifically looking for citizens brave enough to come forward with information about corruption. Father Rodriguez gave Sarah a secure phone number and a code phrase that would identify her as someone he had referred. He explained that the contact was an FBI agent named Jennifer Walsh who specialized in public corruption cases and had a reputation for protecting witnesses while building solid cases against corrupt officials. After her conversation with Father Rodriguez, Sarah felt more hopeful about her situation. She was beginning to build a network of trusted allies who understood the dangers she faced and had the resources to help her navigate the complex legal and political aspects of exposing corruption. However, Sarah's return to work was interrupted by a disturbing development. Detective Morrison was back at the grocery store, this time accompanied by two uniformed police officers. They appeared to be conducting some kind of routine inspection, but Sarah noticed that Morrison was paying particular attention to her work area and asking Mr. Kim detailed questions about her employment history. Sarah continued stocking shelves while listening carefully to the conversation between Morrison and Mr. Kim. The detective was asking about Sarah's schedule, her punctuality, her interactions with customers, and whether she had ever seemed nervous or distracted at work. She's a good employee, Mr. Kim said, clearly uncomfortable with the line of questioning. Very reliable, very honest. Is there some kind of problem? Just a routine background check, Morrison replied smoothly. Nothing to worry about. We're updating our files on young people in the neighborhood who might be good candidates for police youth programs. Sarah recognized the questioning as an intelligence-gathering operation designed to establish her patterns and identify potential vulnerabilities. Morrison was building a profile that would help L. Jeef's organization plan their approach to dealing with her as a threat. After the police officers left, Mr. Kim approached Sarah with obvious concern. He had been running his business in this neighborhood for over a decade and had learned to recognize when police attention wasn't routine or benevolent. Sarah, is there something I should know about? Mr. Kim asked quietly. That detective seemed very interested in you specifically. Sarah realized that Mr. Kim deserved to know enough to protect himself and his business, even if she couldn't tell him everything. She had already involved several people in her situation, and she didn't want her problems to destroy the livelihood of someone who had been kind to her family. Mr. Kim, I might have to take some time off work soon to deal with a family situation, Sarah said carefully. If anyone comes around asking questions about me, please just tell them I was a good employee who left for personal reasons. Mr. Kim studied her face and nodded slowly. As a small business owner in a tough neighborhood, he understood that sometimes the less he knew about certain situations, the safer everyone involved would be. You take care of yourself, Sarah, Mr. Kim said. And, remember, if you need help, you know where to find me. That evening, Sarah met with her mother and cousin Miguel to discuss their next steps. Miguel worked as a paralegal in the district attorney's office and had experience with witness protection procedures and corruption investigations. He had agreed to help after Rosa contacted him and explained that Sarah was facing serious threats related to information she had accidentally obtained. Miguel arrived at their apartment after dark, using the same back alleys and indirect routes that Sarah had been employing to avoid surveillance. He brought with him a briefcase containing legal documents and recording equipment that would help them properly document Sarah's evidence. First thing we need to understand is the scope of what you witnessed, Miguel said, setting up a small digital recorder on the kitchen table. Corruption cases are built on evidence, and the more detailed and specific your testimony, the stronger the case will be. Sarah spent the next hour providing Miguel with a complete account of everything she had seen and heard. Miguel asked detailed questions about timing, locations, descriptions of the people involved, and exact wording of the conversations she had overheard. He also asked about any physical evidence that might still be available, such as security camera footage or financial records. The good news is that what you witnessed sounds like a clear case of bribery and conspiracy, Miguel explained. The bad news is that proving it will require more than just your testimony. We need to find ways to corroborate your account with independent evidence. Miguel suggested that Sarah should contact FBI agent Walsh as soon as possible to begin the formal process of becoming a witness in a federal corruption investigation. He explained that federal agents had resources and authority that local law enforcement couldn't provide, especially when local police departments might be compromised. But, Miguel, what about our safety while this investigation is happening? Rosa asked. If LG finds out that Sarah is cooperating with federal agents, won't that make the danger even worse? Miguel acknowledged that witness protection in corruption cases was a complex process that could take weeks or months to arrange. In the meantime, Sarah would need to continue appearing to follow her normal routine while actually preparing to disappear at a moment's notice if the threat level escalated. The key is making them believe that Sarah is too scared to act, Miguel explained. As long as LG thinks she's intimidated into silence, he'll probably wait before taking more aggressive action. That gives us time to build a case strong enough to arrest everyone involved. After Miguel left, Sarah and her mother spent several hours developing contingency plans for different scenarios. They identified trusted friends and relatives in other cities who could provide temporary shelter if they needed to leave town quickly. They also prepared emergency bags with essential documents, money, and basic supplies. Sarah realized that her situation had evolved into something resume. Sarah's meeting with FBI agent Jennifer Walsh took place in the confessional booth at St. Mary's Church, a location chosen for its privacy and the natural cover it provided for their conversation. Agent Walsh was a 15-year veteran of federal law enforcement with extensive experience in public corruption cases, and she understood the delicate nature of developing witnesses in dangerous situations. Father Rodriguez tells me you have information about police corruption involving gang activity, Agent Walsh said quietly, her voice barely audible through the confessional screen. Before we go any further, I need you to understand the serious nature of what we're discussing. Agent Walsh explained that becoming a federal witness in a corruption case would provide Sarah with protection, but it would also require her to commit to seeing the investigation through to its conclusion, regardless of how long that might take or how dangerous the situation became. I understand the risks, Sarah replied, but I also understand that staying silent means more innocent people will suffer, and eventually LG will probably eliminate me anyway to tie up loose ends. Agent Walsh was impressed by Sarah's clear-headed assessment of her situation. In her experience, witnesses who understood the stakes and made rational decisions based on long-term consequences were more likely to survive dangerous investigations and provide reliable testimony. Sarah spent the next 40 minutes providing Agent Walsh with every detail she could remember about the meeting between LG and Detective Morrison. Agent Walsh asked precise questions about timing, physical descriptions, exact words that were spoken, and any other evidence that might support Sarah's account. What you've described fits a pattern we've been investigating for several months, Agent Walsh explained. Detective Morrison is suspected of involvement in multiple corruption schemes, but we haven't had witnesses willing to come forward with direct evidence. Agent Walsh revealed that the FBI had been building a case against a network of corrupt officials that extended beyond just Detective Morrison and potentially included people in the district attorney's office, city council, and other local government agencies. Sarah's testimony could be the key to breaking open the entire investigation. However, we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed, Agent Walsh warned. If Morrison or his associates suspect that you're cooperating with federal agents, they'll take immediate action to eliminate you as a threat. Agent Walsh outlined a plan that would allow Sarah to continue appearing to follow her normal routine while actually gathering additional evidence that could strengthen the federal case. Sarah would wear a concealed recording device during certain activities and would be trained to recognize opportunities to document corrupt activities without exposing herself to unnecessary danger. The most important thing is that you never try to actively seek out evidence, Agent Walsh emphasized. You continue your daily life, but if opportunities arise to observe or record suspicious activities, you'll be prepared to take advantage of them safely. Agent Walsh also explained that the FBI was already conducting electronic surveillance of Detective Morrison and several other suspects, but legal restrictions limited what they could observe without additional evidence to support expanded investigation authority. Your testimony provides us with probable cause to obtain additional search warrants and surveillance authorizations, Agent Walsh said. That means we can start building a much stronger case while also providing you with better protection. After the meeting concluded, Sarah felt both relief and increased anxiety. Relief because she now had federal law enforcement resources supporting her efforts to expose the corruption, but anxiety because she understood that the stakes had increased significantly. LGF and Detective Morrison would react violently if they discovered her cooperation with the FBI. Sarah's return journey to her apartment required even more careful planning than usual, since she now carried concealed recording equipment and needed to avoid any activity that might reveal her new status as a federal witness. Agent Walsh had trained her in basic counter-surveillance techniques, including how to identify potential followers and how to use reflective surfaces to observe people without being obvious about it. The surveillance team watching Sarah's apartment had grown to include unmarked vehicles positioned at both ends of her block, making it impossible for her to approach her building without being observed. However, Sarah noticed that the watchers seemed more relaxed than they had been earlier in the week, suggesting that they believed their intimidation tactics were working effectively. Sarah decided to reinforce this impression by displaying visible signs of nervousness and fear as she walked the final block to her apartment. She allowed her shoulders to slump, looked around anxiously, and moved with the uncertain gait of someone who was scared and trying not to attract attention. Her performance was designed to make LGF's men believe that their psychological warfare was succeeding. That evening, Sarah's mother noticed her daughter's improved mood despite the continuing danger of their situation. Rosa had been watching Sarah carefully for signs of the stress and fear that would be natural under such circumstances, and she was surprised to see that Sarah seemed more confident and focused than she had been since the crisis began. "You seem different tonight, Mija," Rosa observed. "More like yourself again." Sarah realized that having federal support had indeed changed her perspective on their situation. Instead of feeling trapped and helpless, she now felt like she was part of a larger effort to address the corruption that had been damaging their community for years. "I've been thinking about what Grandpa used to say about fighting back," Sarah replied. "He always said that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about being afraid and still doing what's right." Rosa studied her daughter's face and recognized the determined expression that Sarah had inherited from her grandfather. Colonel Martinez had worn that same expression when he made difficult decisions about military operations, and Rosa had learned to trust that expression even when she didn't fully understand the situations that prompted it. The next morning brought an unexpected development that tested Sarah's new skills and equipment. As she prepared to leave for work, she overheard an argument between two of LGF's lieutenants who were positioned near her apartment building. They were discussing whether they had been waiting too long to take action against Sarah and whether their continued surveillance was attracting unwanted attention from residents and business owners. Sarah activated her concealed recording device and positioned herself where she could clearly hear the conversation while appearing to be engaged in routine morning activities like checking her mail. The argument provided valuable intelligence about LGF's planning timeline and confirmed that some members of his organization were becoming impatient with the passive approach. "LGF wants to wait until after Morrison handles the other situation," one of the men said. "But I think we're giving her too much time to figure out what's happening." "Morrison knows what he's doing," the second man replied. "He says we move too fast, and we bring attention from feds. Better to wait and make it look like random gang violence." Sarah realized that Detective Morrison was orchestrating the timing of their operation against her as part of a larger plan that involved other targets and activities. This information would be extremely valuable to Agent Walsh and the FBI investigation, but it also suggested that Sarah's window of safety was narrower than they had originally calculated. After documenting the conversation, Sarah continued to her job at the grocery store using a route that allowed her to observe additional members of LG's organization. She noticed that several gang members who normally operated in different parts of the neighborhood had been repositioned closer to her usual locations, suggesting that they were preparing for some kind of coordinated action. At work, Sarah's behavior appeared completely normal to Mr. Kim and the customers, but she was actually conducting a systematic assessment of potential threats and escape routes. Agent Walsh had taught her to think like a federal agent gathering intelligence in hostile territory, and Sarah was beginning to understand how her grandfather's military training related to law enforcement techniques. During her lunch break, Sarah met with Mrs. Chun at the community center to share the intelligence she had gathered and to discuss additional ways to document the corruption network's activities. Mrs. Chun had been using her journalism contacts to investigate Detective Morrison's financial records and had discovered several suspicious patterns that supported Sarah's testimony. Morrison has been making cash deposits that don't match his police salary, Mrs. Chun explained. And he's been spending money on luxury items that would be impossible to afford on a detective's income. Mrs. Chun had also learned that Detective Morrison was planning to retire early and move to another state, which suggested that he was preparing to disappear before any investigation could reach him. This information created additional urgency for the FBI's case development timeline. Agent Walsh needs to know about Morrison's retirement plans, Sarah said. If he leaves town, it will be much harder to build a case against the entire network. Mrs. Chun agreed to serve as a communication link between Sarah and Agent Walsh, since direct contact between them would be too dangerous if Sarah's activities were being monitored. They established a secure system for passing information that relied on coded messages and dead drop locations. That afternoon, Sarah's situation became significantly more dangerous when Detective Morrison appeared at the grocery store for the third time in a week. This visit was different from the previous ones, because Morrison was accompanied by LG himself, and they were clearly conducting some kind of final assessment of Sarah and her work environment. Sarah continued stocking shelves while using her peripheral vision to observe the two men's behavior and conversation. Morrison was pointing out details about the store's layout, the location of security cameras, and the timing of employee breaks. LG was asking questions about customer traffic patterns and whether the store had any back exits that might not be visible from the street. The conversation made it clear that Morrison and LG were planning an operation that would take place at or near the grocery store, probably during Sarah's work hours when her location would be predictable. Sarah realized that she had very little time left before they would make their move against her. After Morrison and LG left the store, Sarah excused herself to use the restroom and immediately activated her emergency communication procedure with Agent Walsh. The FBI had given her a special phone number that she could use to send coded text messages indicating different levels of threat and urgency. Sarah's message indicated that she believed an attack was imminent and that she needed immediate extraction from her current location. Agent Walsh's response came within minutes, providing Sarah with instructions for an emergency meeting location and a timeline for federal agents to establish protective surveillance around her. However, Sarah's return to the main area of the store revealed a new complication that threatened to derail her escape plans. Mr. Kim informed her that Detective Morrison had requested her complete work schedule for the rest of the week, claiming that it was needed for a community safety assessment related to crime prevention in the area. Mr. Kim had provided the information because refusing a police request would have seemed suspicious, but he was clearly worried about the implications for Sarah's safety. Sarah realized that Morrison now had detailed knowledge of exactly when and where she would be vulnerable to attack. Mr. Kim, I need to leave work early today for a family emergency. Sarah's escape from the grocery store required every tactical skill her grandfather had taught her about moving through hostile territory without being detected. As she exited the building, she immediately identified 3 members of LG's surveillance team positioned at different locations around the block. Agent Walsh had warned her that the most dangerous moment in any extraction operation was the transition from normal routine to evasive action. Instead of heading directly toward the FBI extraction point, Sarah implemented a complex route designed to test whether she was being followed while gradually leading her pursuers away from federal agents. Her grandfather had called this technique drawing fire away from friendly forces, and it required precise timing and absolute confidence in her ability to reach safety. Sarah's first move was to enter a busy department store through the main entrance and immediately proceed to the women's restroom. Inside, she quickly changed clothes using items from her emergency bag, transforming her appearance from a grocery store employee to a college student. The change included different shoes, a reversible jacket, glasses, and a baseball cap that concealed her distinctive hair. When Sarah emerged from the restroom, she looked sufficiently different that casual observers might not recognize her, but anyone conducting professional surveillance would still be able to maintain visual contact. This was exactly what she wanted, to remain visible enough that her followers wouldn't panic and escalate their response while buying time to reach the extraction point. Sarah's route through the department store took her past multiple exits and through several departments where she could observe potential followers using reflective surfaces and security monitors. She confirmed that at least 2 of Outsma's men had followed her into the store and were attempting to maintain surveillance while appearing to be normal shoppers. After 10 minutes inside the store, Sarah exited through a side entrance that led to a parking garage connected to an adjacent shopping mall. This forced her followers to split up and attempt to cover multiple exit points, reducing their effectiveness and creating opportunities for Sarah to break contact if necessary. The parking garage provided Sarah with her first real opportunity to implement advanced evasion techniques. She moved between parked cars in a pattern that allowed her to observe her followers while making it difficult for them to predict her destination. Agent Walsh had taught her that successful evasion required constant motion combined with frequent changes in direction and speed. Sarah's route through the parking garage led to an underground tunnel that connected to the subway system. This tunnel was known only to regular commuters and was not marked on most maps, making it unlikely that Outsma's men would anticipate its use as an escape route. Once in the subway tunnel, Sarah's advantage increased significantly. The complex layout of the underground system provided multiple routes to her destination, and the constant flow of pedestrians made it nearly impossible for her followers to maintain effective surveillance without exposing themselves to detection. Sarah boarded a subway train heading in the opposite direction from her actual destination, forcing anyone following her to make a decision about whether to board the same train or attempt to anticipate her final destination. She observed through the train windows as the platform cleared, confirming that at least one of her followers had chosen to continue tracking her. At the third stop, Sarah exited the train and immediately boarded another train on a different line, repeating this process twice more before finally heading toward the extraction point. Each transfer required her followers to make rapid decisions about positioning and communication, increasing the likelihood that they would make mistakes or lose contact entirely. Agent Walsh had chosen the extraction point carefully, selecting a location that provided multiple approach routes for Sarah while offering clear sight lines for federal agents to observe potential threats. The location was a public library in a neighborhood that was outside Outsma's normal territory, reducing the likelihood that his organization would have advanced knowledge of escape routes or friendly contacts in the area. Sarah's final approach to the library required her to cross an open plaza where she would be visible from multiple directions. Agent Walsh had explained that this apparent vulnerability was actually a tactical advantage, because it would force any followers to expose themselves if they wanted to maintain visual contact. As Sarah crossed the plaza, she used techniques her grandfather had taught her about moving through sniper territory. She varied her pace, changed direction unpredictably, and used available cover without appearing to be deliberately evasive. To casual observers, she looked like a young woman hurrying to reach the library before closing time. Inside the library, Sarah proceeded to the reference section where Agent Walsh was waiting, disguised as a graduate student researching historical documents. The agent's positioning allowed her to observe all entrances to the building while maintaining plausible cover for being in that location. "You did well getting here," Agent Walsh said quietly, not looking up from her research materials. "My team confirms that you lost your tail somewhere in the subway system." They're probably still trying to figure out where you went. Agent Walsh explained that Sarah's evasion had provided the FBI with valuable intelligence about LG's surveillance capabilities and operational procedures. Federal agents observing the chase had identified several previously unknown members of his organization and had documented their communication methods and tactical approaches. However, your disappearance will force them to escalate their timeline, Agent Walsh warned. They'll assume that you're planning to take action against them, which means they'll probably move against your family and known associates within the next few hours. Agent Walsh revealed that the FBI had already positioned protective surveillance around Sarah's mother, Mrs. Chun, Father Rodriguez, and other people who might be targeted for retaliation. Federal agents were also prepared to make arrests as soon as they had sufficient evidence to ensure successful prosecutions. The question now is whether we have enough evidence to move forward with arrests, or whether we need you to participate in one more operation to gather additional proof, Agent Walsh said. Sarah listened as Agent Walsh outlined two possible scenarios for completing their investigation. The conservative approach would involve placing Sarah and her family in witness protection while federal agents continued building their case using electronic surveillance and financial investigations. This approach would guarantee their safety, but might take months to produce arrests. The aggressive approach would involve Sarah participating in a controlled operation designed to record Detective Morrison and LG discussing their criminal activities. This would provide the definitive evidence needed for immediate arrests, but would expose Sarah to significant risk if anything went wrong. I need to understand the risks of both approaches, Sarah said. If we take the conservative approach, how likely is it that Morrison and LG will figure out that I'm cooperating with federal agents? Agent Walsh explained that Detective Morrison had access to information about FBI investigations through his contacts in local law enforcement. Even with careful operational security, there was a significant chance that he would eventually learn about Sarah's cooperation and take action against her family and associates. The advantage of the aggressive approach is that it gives us control over the timing and circumstances of the final confrontation, Agent Walsh said. Instead of waiting for them to act on their timeline, we force them to react to our plans. Sarah realized that the decision she was facing was similar to tactical choices her grandfather had described from his military experience. Sometimes the safest course of action was actually the most aggressive one, because it allowed you to dictate the terms of engagement rather than responding to enemy initiatives. What exactly would the controlled operation involve? Sarah asked. Agent Walsh outlined a plan that would use Sarah as bait to draw Detective Morrison and LG into a situation where they would discuss their criminal activities while being recorded by FBI surveillance equipment. The operation would take place in a controlled environment where federal agents could provide immediate protection if the situation became dangerous. We would arrange for you to appear to be in a vulnerable position where Morrison and LG would feel confident about approaching you to deliver threats or demand your silence, Agent Walsh explained. The key is making them believe they have the advantage while actually walking into a trap. The plan required Sarah to return to her normal environment and resume her routine activities, but with federal agents providing hidden protection and surveillance equipment recording all interactions with suspects. Morrison and LG would be allowed to approach her, believing that they had successfully intimidated her into isolation from potential help. The biggest risk is that they might decide to eliminate you immediately rather than trying to intimidate you, Agent Walsh acknowledged. But our assessment suggests that Morrison prefers to gather intelligence and plan carefully before taking irreversible action. Sarah considered both options carefully, weighing the immediate risks against long-term consequences for herself and her community. She realized that the aggressive approach aligned with the strategic principles her grandfather had taught her about taking initiative rather than allowing enemies to control the situation. I want to go with the aggressive approach, Sarah decided. But I need guarantees about protection for my mother and the other people who helped me. Agent Walsh assured Sarah that federal agents would provide comprehensive protection for all potential targets, and that arrests would be made immediately after they obtained the recorded evidence of criminal activity. The operation would be carefully planned to minimize risks while maximizing the chances of successful prosecution. However, once we begin this operation, there's no going back, Agent Walsh warned. You'll need to commit to seeing it through regardless of how dangerous or stressful the situation becomes. Sarah thought about her grandfather's lessons regarding courage and commitment under pressure. Colonel Martinez had always taught her that the most important decisions were made when the stakes were highest and the outcome was uncertain. I understand the risks, Sarah said, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes to stop these people from continuing to hurt our community. Agent Walsh spent the next hour briefing Sarah on operational procedure. The final operation began at dawn when Sarah received a coded text message from Agent Walsh confirming that all federal surveillance teams were in position and ready to monitor the controlled confrontation with Detective Morrison and L.G.F. Sarah had spent the previous evening reviewing her operational plan and mentally preparing for what would likely be the most dangerous few hours of her life. Sarah's role in the operation required her to appear vulnerable and isolated while actually being protected by a sophisticated network of hidden federal agents. She would return to her normal routine at the grocery store, but with advanced recording equipment concealed in her clothing and multiple panic signals that could summon immediate assistance. Agent Walsh had positioned FBI surveillance teams at locations throughout the neighborhood, creating overlapping fields of observation that would allow federal agents to monitor every approach to Sarah's position. Additional teams were prepared to make arrests as soon as they had recorded sufficient evidence of criminal conspiracy and corruption. Sarah's walk to work followed her usual route, but she was acutely aware that every step was being observed by multiple parties with conflicting objectives. LG's surveillance team was tracking her movements to confirm that she was following predictable patterns, while FBI agents were monitoring the surveillance team and preparing to intervene if Sarah came under immediate threat. The grocery store had been chosen as the primary location for the controlled confrontation because it provided excellent acoustics for recording equipment while offering multiple escape routes if the situation escalated beyond what federal agents could control safely. Mr. Kim had been briefed by FBI agents and had agreed to cooperate with the operation while maintaining plausible ignorance about Sarah's activities. Sarah's first few hours at work proceeded normally, with no unusual activity from LG's organization or Detective Morrison. Agent Walsh had predicted that the suspects would wait until they could approach Sarah without witnesses present, probably during her lunch break when the store would be less crowded. At exactly noon, Detective Morrison entered the store accompanied by L.G.F. and one of his lieutenants. Their timing confirmed that they had been monitoring Sarah's schedule carefully and were prepared to make their final move against her. Sarah activated her recording equipment and prepared to implement the tactics Agent Walsh had taught her for encouraging suspects to reveal incriminating information. Miss Martinez, we need to have a conversation about your recent activities, Detective Morrison said, approaching Sarah's position near the produce section. His tone was friendly but carried an unmistakable undertone of threat. I don't know what you mean, Detective, Sarah replied, using the script Agent Walsh had prepared. I just work here and go to school. I don't have any activities that would interest the police. L.G. positioned himself where he could observe the store entrances while his lieutenant moved to block Sarah's access to the rear exit. Their tactical positioning revealed professional planning and confirmed that they considered Sarah a serious threat who might attempt to escape or seek help. Don't play games with us, little girl, L.G. said coldly. We know you saw something you shouldn't have seen, and we know you've been asking questions about things that don't concern you. Detective Morrison raised his hand to silence L.G., clearly preferring to handle the interrogation himself. His approach was more subtle but potentially more dangerous because he understood legal procedures and knew how to extract information without obviously violating Sarah's rights. Sarah, I think there's been a misunderstanding, Morrison said, his voice taking on a false paternal tone. We're not here to threaten you. We just want to make sure you understand the situation you've accidentally become involved in. Morrison explained that Sarah had witnessed a routine police operation involving undercover work with confidential informants. He claimed that her presence at the meeting had compromised an ongoing investigation into drug trafficking, and that her continued silence was necessary to protect both the investigation and her own safety. The problem is, some people think you might be planning to talk about what you saw, Morrison continued, and that makes them very nervous about their own safety and the safety of their families. Sarah recognized Morrison's approach as a sophisticated intimidation technique designed to make her believe that cooperation with law enforcement would actually put her in more danger than remaining silent. Agent Walsh had prepared her for this possibility and had coached her on how to respond in ways that would encourage Morrison to reveal his true relationship with LG's organization. "I understand that police work is complicated," Sarah said carefully. "But I'm just a regular person trying to stay out of trouble. If there's something I should or shouldn't do to stay safe, I need someone to explain it clearly." LG became impatient with Morrison's indirect approach and stepped closer to Sarah, his body language becoming more threatening. His interruption was exactly what Agent Walsh had hoped for, because it would force Morrison to either control his criminal associate or reveal the true nature of their relationship. "Let me explain it clearly," LG said angrily. "You keep your mouth shut about everything you saw, or very bad things happened to you and your mother. This isn't complicated." "Miguel, calm down," Morrison said quickly. "This isn't how we handle these situations professionally." Morrison's use of LG's real name and his obvious familiarity with intimidation procedures provided the FBI with clear evidence of their criminal partnership. Agent Walsh had explained that corruption cases often depended on such moments when suspects revealed information that proved conspiracy beyond reasonable doubt. Sarah continued the conversation by expressing fear and confusion about the conflicting messages she was receiving, encouraging Morrison to provide more details about the supposed police operation and his relationship with LG's organization. "Detective Morrison, I'm scared and confused," Sarah said. "You say this is about police work, but it feels like something else entirely. I need to understand what's really happening so I can make the right decisions for my family's safety." Morrison realized that Sarah's questions were pushing the conversation into dangerous territory where he might reveal information that could be used against him in court. However, LG's impatience and the need to resolve the situation quickly were forcing Morrison to take risks that he would normally avoid. "The reality is that police work sometimes requires cooperation with people who operate outside normal legal boundaries," Morrison said carefully. "My relationship with Miguel's organization serves legitimate law enforcement purposes, but it has to remain confidential to protect ongoing operations." Sarah recognized that Morrison was attempting to provide legal justification for his corrupt activities while simultaneously threatening her with violence if she revealed what she had witnessed. Agent Walsh had predicted this exact scenario and had instructed Sarah to press for more specific details about the financial arrangements between Morrison and LG. "I understand about confidential operations," Sarah said. "But when I saw you two meeting, it looked like money was changing hands. How does that fit with police procedures?" LG laughed harshly at Sarah's question, clearly amused by what he perceived as naivety about police corruption. His response provided additional evidence that would support federal charges against both men. "Police procedures?" LG said mockingly. "Morrison here has been on my payroll for 3 years. He provides information about police investigations, and we provide him with enough money to live better than any honest cop could afford." Morrison's face went pale as he realized that LG had just confessed to bribing a police officer while being recorded. He immediately attempted to control the damage by claiming that LG was lying, but his obvious panic confirmed the truth of the statement. "Miguel is exaggerating our relationship," Morrison said desperately. "Any financial arrangements between us are related to his role as a confidential informant, which is completely legal and properly documented." Sarah pressed her advantage by asking Morrison to provide documentation of LG's status as a confidential informant, knowing that no such documentation existed because their relationship was purely criminal. Morrison's inability to produce legitimate paperwork would provide additional evidence of corruption. If Miguel is really a confidential informant, shouldn't there be official records I could verify? Sarah asked. "My cousin works in the district attorney's office, and he tells me that informant relationships have to be properly documented to be legal." Morrison realized that Sarah's questions were too sophisticated for someone who was simply scared and confused. His expression changed as he began to suspect that Sarah might be gathering information deliberately rather than seeking reassurance about her safety. "You seem to know a lot about law enforcement procedures for a grocery store clerk," Morrison said suspiciously. Maybe we need to have a different kind of conversation about what you're really doing here. Agent Walsh had prepared Sarah for the possibility that Morrison would become suspicious of her knowledge and tactics. The backup plan required Sarah to signal for immediate extraction if Morrison began treating her as a deliberate threat rather than an accidental witness. However, before Sarah could activate her panic signal, LG made a decision that changed the entire situation. Convinced that Sarah was working with law enforcement and frustrated by Morrison's cautious approach, LG drew a concealed weapon and pointed it directly at Sarah. "I don't care about your police procedures anymore," LG said to Morrison. "This girl knows too much, and she's obviously working with someone. We in this problem right now." Morrison found himself caught between his desire to avoid a murder charge and his need to maintain his relationship with LG's organization. His hesitation provided Sarah with crucial seconds to activate her emergency signal and prepare for federal intervention. "Miguel, put the gun away," Morrison said urgently. "Killing her here will bring too much attention. We need to handle this somewhere else." LG's response revealed the full scope of their criminal planning and provided the FBI with evidence of premeditated conspiracy to commit murder. His words were being recorded clearly, ensuring that both men would face serious federal charges. "We already planned this, remember?" LG said impatiently. "Make it look like gang violence. The other cops you control will make sure the investigation goes nowhere. This has to happen today before she talks to more people." At that moment, FBI agents positioned throughout the store revealed themselves simultaneously, surrounding Morrison and LG with overwhelming force while ensuring Sarah's immediate safety. Agent Walsh emerged from behind the customer service counter, where she had been monitoring the entire conversation. "FBI, drop your weapon and put your hands where we can see them," Agent Walsh commanded, her service weapon trained on LG while backup agents moved to secure Morrison. LG's reaction confirmed his guilt and the premeditated nature of his crimes against Sarah. Instead of surrendering immediately, he attempted to use Sarah as a human shield while threatening to kill her if federal agents didn't allow him to escape. "I'll kill her if you don't back off," LG shouted, grabbing Sarah and pressing his weapon against her neck. "I walk out of here, or she dies." Agent Walsh had prepared for this possibility and had positioned a sniper in the store's upper level with a clear shot at LG's position. However, the immediate priority was protecting Sarah while securing evidence of the crimes that had been recorded during the confrontation. "Miguel, you're surrounded, and there's no escape," Agent Walsh said calmly. "The building is sealed, and we have everything on tape. Your only option now is to surrender peacefully and hope for consideration during sentencing." Detective Morrison attempted to distance himself from LG's actions by claiming that he had been trying to prevent violence and had been coerced into cooperation with the criminal organization. However, the recorded conversation had already provided clear evidence of his willing participation in corruption and conspiracy. Sarah remained calm despite the immediate physical danger, remembering her grandfather's lessons about maintaining clear thinking under extreme pressure. She watched for opportunities to assist in her own rescue while avoiding actions that might provoke LG into violence. The standoff continued for several tense minutes before LG realized that his situation was hopeless and federal agents were prepared to use lethal force to protect Sarah. He gradually released his grip and allowed FBI agents to take him into custody without further resistance. With both suspects secured and comprehensive evidence of their crimes recorded, Sarah's mission was complete. She had successfully exposed a corruption network that had been operating in her community for years, while using strategic thinking and tactical skills that would have made her grandfather proud. Agent Walsh approached Sarah as the suspects were being transported to federal detention facilities, her expression reflecting both professional satisfaction and personal admiration for Sarah's courage and competence throughout the dangerous operation. "You did exactly what a trained federal agent would have done in this situation," Agent Walsh said. "Your grandfather's military training and your own strategic thinking saved not just your life, but probably the lives of many other people who would have been victimized by this corruption network." Sarah realized that her accidental discovery of criminal activity had evolved into something much larger than personal survival. By choosing to fight back rather than remain silent, She had helped federal law enforcement dismantle a criminal conspiracy that extended throughout local government and law enforcement agencies. The arrests of Detective Morrison and LG led to additional investigations that ultimately resulted in the prosecution of 12 corrupt officials and the dismantling of several criminal organizations that had been operating under police protection. Sarah's testimony became the foundation for one of the largest corruption cases in the region's history. 6 months later, Sarah began her studies at the FBI Academy, having been recruited by Agent Walsh for federal law enforcement training. Her unique combination of strategic thinking, tactical awareness, and moral courage made her an ideal candidate for investigating complex corruption cases in communities similar to the one where she had grown up. Sarah's story became an example of how ordinary citizens could make extraordinary differences when they possessed the knowledge, courage, and strategic thinking necessary to outmaneuver professional criminals. Her grandfather's military lessons had prepared her for a battle she never expected to fight, and her victory had protected an entire community from the criminals who had been exploiting it for their own profit. The operation was scheduled to begin the following morning, giving federal agents time to position surveillance teams and prepare arrest warrants based on the evidence Sarah had already provided. Detective Morrison and LG would be allowed to believe that they had successfully cornered Sarah, when in reality they would be walking into a carefully prepared trap. As the briefing concluded, Sarah felt a mixture of fear and anticipation that reminded her of stories her grandfather had told about preparing for dangerous military missions. She understood that the next 24 hours would determine whether her strategic thinking and careful planning had been adequate to defeat opponents who had much more experience with violence and intimidation. "Remember," Agent Walsh said as they prepared to leave the library separately, "your grandfather's military training taught you to think strategically under pressure. Tomorrow, you'll find out whether those lessons were enough to help you outsmart some very dangerous people." Sarah nodded and began her journey back to her neighborhood, where she would spend the evening preparing for what she hoped would be the final phase of her mission to expose corruption and protect the innocent people who had become targets of criminal conspiracy. The young woman who had accidentally witnessed a criminal meeting was about to transform into a federal operative conducting a dangerous mission against experienced criminals. Everything her grandfather had taught her about courage, strategy, and tactical thinking would be tested in a real-world situation where failure could mean death for herself and the people she was trying to protect. Ross said, making a decision that would force her to accelerate her timeline significantly. "I might not be able to come back for a few days." Mr. Kim nodded understanding, but Sarah could see the concern in his expression. He had clearly recognized that Detective Morrison's interest in Sarah was not routine police business, and he was worried about what might happen to her. "You be very careful, Sarah," Mr. Kim said quietly. "And remember, sometimes the smartest thing to do is run away and come back to fight another day." Sarah gathered her personal belongings and prepared to leave the store, knowing that her departure would trigger immediate response from LG's surveillance team. Agent Walsh had instructed her to proceed to a predetermined location where federal agents would be waiting to provide protection and begin the next phase of their operation. As Sarah walked toward the exit, she mentally reviewed the counter-surveillance techniques Agent Walsh had taught her and prepared to implement an escape plan that would allow her to reach the FBI extraction point without leading LG's men directly to federal agents. The next few hours would determine whether Sarah's strategic thinking and her grandfather's military lessons had prepared her adequately for the most dangerous phase of her mission. She was about to discover whether a young woman from East Los Angeles could successfully outmaneuver experienced criminals and corrupt police officers who were determined to silence her permanently. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped out of the grocery store, beginning what she hoped would be the final phase of her operation to expose the corruption network and protect her community from the criminals who had been exploiting it for their own profit. Building a military operation with multiple phases, contingency plans, and careful coordination between various allies. Her grandfather's lessons about strategic thinking were proving more valuable than she had ever imagined. The next morning brought a new challenge that tested Sarah's ability to maintain her cover while advancing her mission. As she prepared to leave for work, She noticed that the surveillance team watching her apartment had been reinforced with additional personnel. There were now at least 6 people positioned at various locations around her building, making it much more difficult to move undetected. Sarah realized that LG was increasing pressure on her, possibly in preparation for making a decisive move. She would need to accelerate her timeline while being even more careful about operational security. The game was intensifying, and her next moves would determine whether she could outmaneuver her opponents or whether they would succeed in silencing her permanently. Standing at her bedroom window, Sarah studied the positions of LG's watchers and began planning her route for the day. She had learned from her grandfather that successful military operations required adapting to changing conditions while maintaining focus on the primary objective. Her primary objective remained the same: expose the corruption network before they could eliminate her as a threat. Sarah checked her phone and saw a text message from an unknown number containing only the words confessional. 6 p.m. JW. She recognized this as a message from FBI agent Walsh, arranged through Father Rodriguez's contact system. The investigation was about to enter a new phase, and Sarah would finally have the federal resources she needed to protect herself and her community. But first, she would need to survive the next few hours while LG's surveillance network tracked her every move, and Detective Morrison continued gathering intelligence for what appeared to be an imminent operation against her. Sarah took a deep breath and reminded herself of her grandfather's most important lesson: victory belonged to those who could think clearly under pressure and adapt their strategies to overcome any obstacle. From the community center, she used to be an investigative journalist before she retired. And there's Father Rodriguez at St. Mary's. He's been fighting gang influence in the neighborhood for years. Rosa nodded slowly. And there's your cousin Miguel in the district attorney's office. If we can prove corruption, he might know who to trust in law enforcement. As they talked through the night, Sarah's plan began to take shape. Instead of fighting LG directly, she would expose the entire corruption network, making it impossible for them to eliminate her without drawing unwanted attention from honest law enforcement officials. But first, Sarah needed to survive the next few days while she gathered evidence and contacted her allies. That meant staying one step ahead of her watchers while appearing to follow her normal routine. It meant thinking like a Navy SEAL operating behind enemy lines, using stealth and deception rather than direct confrontation. Sarah spent the rest of the night studying her maps and planning her moves for the following day. She would need to contact her allies without being detected, gather more evidence of the corruption, and establish safe communication channels. Most importantly, she would need to make LG believe that she was either unaware of the danger or too scared to act. As dawn broke over East Los Angeles, Sarah understood that the next phase of her life would require every lesson her grandfather had taught her about strategy, patience, and courage. She was about to begin the most dangerous game of her young life, with stakes that could determine not just her survival, but the future of her entire community.